Welcome, everyone, to this episode of The Lift. We're going to be talking about evaluating the effects of supervision. This is Linda.
And Tyra.
And we're going to be joined by our guest, Dr. Lisa Britton, today. I have known Lisa for well over 20 years and count her as a dear friend and colleague. So we're so happy to have her with us. She's a BCBA and the owner of Britton Behavioral Consulting. She got her master's degree and PhD from the University of Nevada, Reno, which is where I first met her. And she was working with Dr. Jim Carr, who I also know. Her primary focus is on providing behavior supports to students with special education needs and also providing effective remote supervision for fieldwork hours. And if you haven't read it, you should. She's published a fantastic book titled Remote Fieldwork Supervision for BCBA Trainees with her co-author, Matt Sikoria, who also has a podcast. So welcome, Lisa. We're so happy to have you with us.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to join you guys.
Yay. Now, Lisa, we have a quote for this chapter, and it says, if you haven't measured something, you really don't know very much about it, by Carl Pearson. And this chapter is really about trying to measure something that a lot of people think of as pretty nebulous.
That is true. I just want to jump in and say, I think the requirement that we need to evaluate the effects of our supervision makes so much sense, but apparently it freaks a lot of people out.
I think that's a really good point. And I think the word nebulous is a very accurate one. I mean, I think that it can be really challenging. And so we feel like there's this obligation to collect the data. But then what is it that we're supposed to do with the information that we gather? And how is that going to impact our behavior moving forward? So I can't wait to have this conversation.
Well, and assuming we actually get data and don't just go with our own intuition and observation, which can be a little faulty. So let's get us started with one of the themes throughout the book is a focus on self-reflective practice. And of course, also building strong collaborative relationships, as well as teaching a variety of critical skills. But that notion of evaluating the effects of your supervisory practice, to me, that goes right back to self-reflection. It would never occur to you to evaluate the effects of your supervisory practice if you weren't reflecting on, how is this going? What am I doing? And really being able to even describe that. And so I think I could be wrong about this, but we may well have been in a period where most people didn't take a particularly systematic approach to evaluating the effects of their supervision. They were doing the best they knew how to do and hopefully seeing some good effects and likely being convinced by those good effects, which I think hopefully now we can think of that as the old school way to do it. But I think there are a lot of risks with that approach. And I did take that approach for a long, long time. So, all of those risks were true for me. What are some of the risks that worry you when people take that approach?
Oh, great question. So, I think that obviously there's a risk certainly for the trainee, but also there is a risk for the supervisor, for future trainees, as well as the field as a whole. I mean, we run the risk that stakeholders are going to make the assumption that behavior analysis is ineffective, and they may choose a different approach, and that approach might not be evidence-based. And so it's just really important for us to ensure that we're evaluating our supervision practices and that we're really giving our trainee the best skills moving forward. And I think on the flip side, in terms of benefits, not only does the trainee benefit, but we benefit as well as supervisors. I can't, emphasize enough how much I've improved as a supervisor by really looking at the performance of my trainees and how I am building their skill sets or not, and what I need to do different accordingly. And I just can't wait to see what kind of supervisor I am, 10 years from now, because hopefully I will be much better than I am today.
So well put, so well put. And I think like you nailed it in terms of the multifaceted risks associated, right? Risks to yourself not developing appropriate skills, or maybe strengthening skills that aren't that effective. Risk to your trainee that they may not develop appropriate clinical repertoires, or they might not develop appropriate future supervisory skills, or worse, that they might develop defective skill sets that could be dangerous, and impacts to the profession and to stakeholders as well. And I think that there's a direct risk to clients too, because especially if we're thinking about trainees, people accruing their fieldwork experience hours, they're working directly with clients. And so substandard supervision, or even okay supervision that you're not actually keeping an eye on to make sure that you're getting the results you want, it stands to reason that the trainee could be engaging in non-optimal behavior with clients, and clients could be impacted. Does that freak you out too, both of you?
Freaks me out. Yes, freaks me out. But I will say the flip side of that, of the benefit being like, do it. And if you do it, you not only avoid those risks, you learn more. And, Lisa, as you were talking about, I can't wait to see what I'm going to be like in 10 years. I definitely, that resonates with me, in that a whole lot of my continued learning, growth, and development, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, has been based on efforts to become a better supervisor, reflecting on, why do I make the clinical decisions that I make, and how can I convey that to other people? And to me, it has kept the field interesting to me. And that keeps me excited and learning and growing. And even though I'm busy, it's like my best shield against burnout. As long as I feel like I'm still getting better and still have something to offer and still learning, I can keep doing this stuff, and I think it's really, that's a benefit. And the other benefit is that, we have these biases that we have to recognize that are there. And the most core for me is, I wouldn't be supervising that way if I didn't think that was a pretty good way to supervise. I might be dead wrong. It might be wildly ineffective, but the fact that I'm behaving that way kind of speaks to a little bit of it, at least implicit bias, that that's the way to do it, or that that's likely to work based on my history. And if you're not directly evaluating the effects, you'll never find out that that's not a particularly good way to do it. What are some of the other kinds of biases that either of you have kind of, seen that you might bring to the table?
As a slightly different way of looking at biases is, we might make some inaccurate assumptions about our trainees in terms of how skilled they are and what it is that we need to be focusing on. Either somebody might be able to verbalize in a very effective way a skill set that may not actually be there, or conversely, we might, because somebody is very quiet, make some assumptions about need areas that actually aren't there. And if we're not doing an assessment of the trainee's skills, then we run the risk of not addressing a need area because we assume it's not there, or working on a skill that we could have been using that time for something else. And that's something that's really scary to me that, you know, we're wasting time and our supervision time is just so valuable.
And limited. So we got to make the most of it.
Absolutely. And so critical. And I think for me, it's very similar, just that idea that I could have some sort of bias in some way that maybe someone isn't making progress because of some characteristic or some factor that I am ascribing to them, or I'm somehow tacting, versus, well, I'm a variable in this equation as well. And have I been looking not only at the outcomes, which, okay, I'm saying this person isn't making progress, but then the inputs. It's not just that, it's not that trainee by themselves. What about my teaching strategies could be non-optimal for that person? And if I made a change, they could have a different outcome. So I think quite similar to what you two sort of experienced or expressed. I think that what stumps people, well, first of all, just stepping back, I think having the conversation about the risks and the benefits is really important, because I think for individuals that don't actively engage in evaluating the effects of their supervision, it may be because they just haven't stopped to really think about why it's so important, right? So that's like the foundation of the conversation. But I think the next piece that sort of stumps folks is, well, what do I look at? What do I
measure?
Exactly. Yeah. What sorts of things, like you said, Linda, if I sort of feel like it's going okay, if I feel like things are on track, that should be enough, because I'm, you know, experienced or what have you. And we all know, even, you know, those of us with a lot of experience, that that's not always true. And so I think, like, let's talk a little bit about what are some of the things that we personally have used to measure the outcomes or the impact of our supervisory practices, that maybe folks listening could grab that and say, like, oh yeah, that's easy. I could, like, for example, for me, I like to keep an eye on how many appointments are missed, how many of my meetings are canceled, or does my trainee show up late for? And I know that doesn't seem like, well, why would that, doesn't have anything to do with, you know, did they master this thing you taught them? No, but it might speak to the health of my supervisory relationship, and the health of my supervisory relationship will directly impact the effectiveness of my supervision. So that's an easy thing to track. I would review fairly often. How often was that person late? How often did they cancel? And if it was a pattern, it gave me something to start looking into. So that's one thing I think people might not think about, linking to the effects of their supervision. But that's an easy one, right? Like, just put a note in your calendar.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And along the same lines is, how did you feel when that cancellation occurred? Were you disappointed, or were you excited? And taking note of your reaction to those type of things, to assess that relationship as well. You know, is there some avoidance behaviors that maybe are occurring on both sides? Yep. And what can we do to fix that?
Yes, absolutely. I think for listeners, the obvious place to go is, if you're using a competency-based approach to your supervisory practices, you should be able to go to a spreadsheet or a document that you're keeping that would say, I introduced this content area or this skill on this date, and it was mastered on this date, or it wasn't mastered, and I had to continue to go over and over. Those are I think the easy things that we could go to, right? Like, look at the acquisition and the maintenance and the generalization of the skills and the knowledge that you're trying to impart to your trainees. So that one seems easy. You could have percentage of task list items mastered, or, you know, do you see that if things are equal difficulty level, that people are mastering them faster. But it's interesting that when I speak to people, and when some colleagues and I did a study and we sort of were asking questions about what you measure and how you measure it, people really felt like, I wouldn't even know where to start with measuring the outcomes of my supervision. I don't even know what to look at. But you would look at the same kinds of things you do with client programming, right? Like percent mastered, rate of mastery, like need for booster sessions, failure to maintain, failure to generalize. And I know you do a lot of specific individualization in your work, Lisa. Do you have some specific things that you look at?
It's all of the above. Like those are some really great things to track, and it takes time to develop those systems. And so I think it's really important for people to not feel like, oh, I don't have these things, so I'm just not going to do it. Like pick one thing and develop a system around that one thing. And then once you have that in place, then you can introduce another thing. And so
what I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but thank you for saying that, because the last thing we want to do is say, you should have all of this and it should be perfect right now. None of us have perfect systems. So thank you so much for saying that. Just pick a place and get started, and that will do wonders for the world.
Absolutely. And I think another piece that we can look at is client outcomes. And so typically our trainees are working with clients. And so the ultimate goal is that they're building the skill set of their clients. And so let's take a look at client data as a measure of the effectiveness of our supervision process. Are they building their skills in terms of skill acquisition? If they've conducted a functional behavior assessment and introduced a behavior plan, are we seeing an appropriate reduction in those problem behaviors and so forth? And so I think we can get at a lot of those things. Those are indirect measures of our supervision practices, but it's an important measure nonetheless.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can, sorry.
No, I was just wanted to high five Lisa, like indirect measures are okay too.
They absolutely are. And sometimes it's indirect, but just barely. So if there's a specific thing that you're working with your supervisee trainee, and really all of these ideas are equally applicable to RBTs that you're working with. They don't have to be in coursework for you to be having positive effects with them. And if what you're working with them on is having more naturalistic teaching, having more engaging, fun sessions, and you see clients smiling and laughing and responding more quickly and being more engaged and having more initiations of responses, shortened latencies to respond, then I would suggest you're producing an effect on that supervisee's behavior that's then directly observable as an effect on that client. So some of them are going to be a little bit more indirect, but some of them can be really quite direct.
I agree.
Great point.
Yeah. I just want to talk just for a second about things like affect or indices of therapeutic relationship, whether or not that's the supervisor is kind of taking a look at how their trainee, or to Linda's point, their staff, right? Their RBT or their BCABA, or shoot, maybe you're a senior clinician and you're supervising another BCBA. But, if they're looking at that person's interaction with a client or a caregiver, or they're thinking about their own interaction with that person, I think there's a tendency for some people to sort of poo-poo or turn their nose up at the idea that you can come up with at least some modicum of an objective rating or something like that of affect, like, back and forth conversation versus someone just sitting there passively and not being engaged, or smiling, or, whatever, hanging out a few minutes after the meeting just to say thank you, or whatever it's going to be. And I wonder if maybe we can spend just a few minutes talking about that, because I think it's something that we don't do very well at as behavior analysts. And I think if we're not doing well with it, we're probably not teaching it well to other people, right? So especially
that notion of the person that you're supervising how responsive and engaged and interactive they are with you in the supervision session.
Yeah, or how engaged and interactive they are with other people that you are hoping to impact, or how those individuals are engaging with your trainee, right? So maybe it's a parent and you're watching your trainee do an interview. How is that other person? And so what are some of the things that you all think people should easily be able to kind of take anecdotal notes, or maybe come up with a rating scale? Like, let's just give listeners some ideas.
I will say that's something I never take data on unless it feels like a problem. You know, when it's going well, you're just enjoying the experience. You're talking back and forth. You can tell you're both happy and engaged. And it never occurs to me to take explicit data on it then. But there are times when it's like, oh, I need to pull things out of this person. And I wish that they were able to, or that they did, initiate some of the topics of conversation, or state a little bit what they'd like to get, or what have you. I think then it very much occurs to me to start measuring something. That's not to say that I shouldn't measure it the other times. I'm just saying this is the real world. And that when it's going real well, it's almost the background for me. It just feels, yep, it's good, it's right. This is enjoyable. This person's clearly learning and getting things from this and telling me what they need me to give them. And when it's not there, then I start thinking about those as things that I'd like to see increase in frequency.
I love that. But it made me think, because I think I do something similar, but it made me think really at the end of that good interaction, then I should be documenting somewhere, even if I'm not taking explicit data throughout, maybe just a plus at the bottom of that agenda meeting, that one was like a thumbs up. And that way, at the end of the meeting, I'm doing sort of a post debrief with myself. And if I find that I'm hesitant to give it a plus, then maybe I can start taking those data before a bigger problem is developing. Do you know what I mean? So I get it. Like, don't take data if it's not useful, but maybe some sort of check-in just to kind of remind yourself.
Along the same lines, one of the things that I like to take note of is those meetings that I am so excited for when I see that one on the calendar, and it energizes me each and every time. And then I want to kind of tact, what is it about that's taking place within that meeting, and how can I reframe other meetings to replicate that with other people? So are there some better expectations that I can put forth as a result of the information that I'm getting from that particular meeting? Is there something I need to do differently in terms of my level of preparation or something like that? And so I think that's an important piece as well, is when something's especially good, you want to replicate that.
And take data on your own behavior.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I love that, Lisa. That's so linked to the idea of this continued self-reflective practice as a supervisor, and that evaluating the effects of your supervision isn't just something you do once a quarter, right? It's something you're doing all the time. That's such a cool idea.
I think another thing to look at in terms of affect and things like that is, kind of going along the lines of what Linda was talking about in terms of, does the client approach this person? How is their instructional control? Is there something that they need to do more of in terms of pairing with reinforcement and making themselves a conditioned reinforcer? And that can be a conditioned reinforcer for the client, for the parent, for other stakeholders, for RBTs, and that list can go on and on.
Yep, I 100% agree. And I think sometimes watching a trainee or a supervisee interact with their peers or interact with caregivers is really telling. Are the caregivers leaning in and interested, asking questions? Are their peers doing the same kind of thing? Is there sort of, I don't quite know how to measure this, but can you can you detect or discriminate that there's sort of like a mutual positive regard between those individuals? And I think that that's really important, because to be effective, we have to have good interpersonal skills, and we have to be able to engage with folks. So I think gone should be the days when all supervision occurred either in the supervisor's office, or the supervisor just, you know, watching the client programming interactions. Like, whenever you can capture those other interactions that just sort of happen more naturally, or you know, maybe aren't quite perfectly linked to a task list item, that's sometimes when you get really critical information about strengths or areas of growth for your trainees and supervisees.
Mm-hmm. And that's a place to really kind of put in the point that most of the supervision that I do is remote supervision, to be completely honest. And that is the biggest disadvantage of that approach, is that when you have that in-person supervision and you are working shoulder to shoulder, and you see that in the moment situation, and you're able to reinforce the things that you want to reinforce and correct the things that need to be corrected, you're going to have a better opportunity to do that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wonder what the two of you think about doing formal surveys of other individuals. For example, doing a satisfaction survey of caregivers, or something like that, to kind of, like, yes, you're sort of asking about your trainees' behavior, but again, Linda, linked to the things that you have been working on. Is that something that either of you have done? Has it gone well? What are some strategies maybe that folks could use to do that?
You know, I think when your numbers are bigger, such that there is some perceived anonymity, and you want it to be real anonymity. Sometimes there's real anonymity, but it's not perceived as such.
Sure.
I think it goes better. It's more reasonable to expect honest response from one of those structured surveys. Otherwise, you do often get an effect where people tend to report positively for any of a variety of reasons. In fact, when you kind of, one of the recommendations in these kind of surveys is anything that's not a 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5, or 8 out of 10 or higher indicates a problem, because there is such a positive response bias. And so even just middle scores on those kinds of rating scales can indicate that there are problems. So it's like, we know that there's response bias built into those, and it gets ever bigger when it's a small number of respondents. And so I have used those like company-wide, and it's always something that you're battling against. I don't use them for myself because I usually have a very small number of respondents, and so I know there's no anonymity. I tend to prefer a more informal approach rather than a survey-based approach. But if I had a whole bunch of supervisees, I might like the other approach. Lisa, what do you think?
I agree with you in terms of some of the challenges that you get with doing that survey approach. I have not had the opportunity to do that with stakeholders, but I have done some surveys with trainees, and it has been a really nice way to get some additional information on what I can do better in terms of, you know, maybe more video models of particular skills, or you know, hey, I really want to learn about such and such, and that isn't currently within my curriculum, and things like that.
Yeah, I like that. And really, it sounds like you do a survey that is really more about, rather than a rating, right? How good is this thing? It's about, what are some things that would be useful to have? What are some things that could be different? And whether you're saying that live in a conversation, or providing a written opportunity to answer that framing of it as what could make this more valuable? What might be nice to have more of? What might be nice if it were different? Really, I think makes it more okay to respond in any way, right?
Yeah.
The right
Yeah.
answer is give me some stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And as you are articulating that, it made me realize, like, I do have some questions that are Likert scale type, and I almost always ignore that information. I go to the open-ended information because that's where the meat is.
Yeah, that's where the good stuff.
I appreciate you talking sort of about the considerations around anonymity and perceived anonymity and some of the risks associated when you don't have sufficient anonymity. And I think that is really important. And I often have people saying that they wish that they had enough trainees that they could just use an anonymous survey. And I get that. And I understand sort of the perceived idea that if I can get feedback anonymously, it will be honest. And I just want to throw out there that I think that that should be your last go-to. I think that you should focus on creating a relationship and fostering a relationship that will allow for both parties to give that feedback directly to one another, and not require anonymity for us to say the hard things. And I wonder if either of you have thoughts about that, if you have your own preferences about that.
No, I totally agree with that. That's one of the reasons why I prefer to kind of do it as a live Q&A, to ask that question of, tell me something I could do differently in our next supervision or next month of supervision, that, or something that you really wish we could focus on and target, but doing it kind of as a live conversation. Even if I ask the question now and say, think about this a little bit, and you can either tell me next time or email me or what have you, I generally prefer to have it as an interaction that's dynamic.
Yeah, I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth in terms of what I recall from the book itself, but I feel like you guys talk about this. And one of the things that you also talk about, if I remember correctly, is to take culture into account with this, that some people are going to feel very awkward providing feedback to a supervisor because of their history. And so we need to be thoughtful about that as well. And so I think there's some ways that maybe we can couch this, and in that intro of the relationship at the beginning, having that conversation about, well, how do you like to receive feedback? How do you like to deliver feedback? Mm-hmm. Do you want to deliver that through an email? Do you want to deliver that through a survey? Should we have a conversation at the end of each meeting? And really kind of not having, this is how I get my information, but tailoring it to the needs of the trainee.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I love that you sort of brought it back to being culturally responsive. And I think that I suppose my perspective is just that it can be easy to say, it's going to be difficult for this person to share feedback with me, so I'm going to go the route of providing anonymity, versus I've got that in my back pocket if I need it. Let's see if I can build a relationship where I show them they can trust me, and that I want their feedback. It's valuable to me. It's going to make me a better person. I'm going to implement it. And so, yeah, at so many of my talks about supervision, that's what people want to know. Like, how do I get anonymous feedback? Like, well, here's how you can do it. But first think about, do you want to go there first, or are there some other things that you could do? And I will say, people increasingly have asked for strategies. How do I facilitate starting to get my trainees and supervisees to feel comfortable giving me feedback about my practices? So maybe we can chat a little bit more about that. I mean, for example, I know that things that I try to do is if there's any like natural feedback opportunity that happens, and I provide people with a lot, because as Linda can attest, I am a terrible typist, like really to the point probably of some people getting frustrated watching me type. And so if I'm, sharing my screen and I'm typing something and a supervisee or someone, a trainee says like, oh, you typoed that word. To me, that's the start of, wow, you gave me feedback as your supervisor. Thank you. Like, thank you for avoiding me looking less professional than I would like to. Thank you for putting yourself on the line to tell me that. So I try to capture the tiniest instances and really tack them as, wow, thank you for that feedback, even if it literally was just you typoed that thing. How about you two?
I think I like that. And it almost feels like a shaping procedure where you're starting small at that person's baseline and reinforcing those successive approximations so that you can hopefully get that person to the feedback that is truly going to be meaningful in terms of changing your practices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think probably my primary strategy is certainly if I make an error, I'll describe it I'll give myself some feedback.
Oh,
and I want people to see it being okay, that I can notice my own mistakes and I'll just talk about it. And I don't mean casually, but I mean without, a whole lot of self-consciousness, I think the other thing I do is try to use open-ended questions whenever I can, where the any answer you give, as long as you think about something, is useful and helpful and meaningful, and will move us a little farther down the line, whether it is certainly I've already said a few, like what is something that I could do differently? What's one thing that you hope I keep doing?
yeah.
Those kinds of things. But, I think particularly where I think people get a little more nervous about evaluating their feedback is when they think it might not be going as well as it could. To be honest with you, we're all happy to get that data when we're crushing it. And when something feels a little nervous or tenuous, whether it is in the relationship or just that I'm not seeing the change that I could, I sometimes try to find like a canary in a coal mine repertoire. And one of those, I think that like, if this isn't changing, I'll bet nothing else is changing either. So one of the things I like to do is ask a certain kind of question each session. Like, what did you notice or think to yourself about what you were doing while you were doing it? And very often the first responses to that are, what? I didn't think about anything while I was doing. And if the repeat, and then of course, kind of talk them through like, well, as you're doing that next time, try to notice, does this feel easy? Does this feel hard? Does this feel, whatever it might be? Or am I noticing something about either this client's behavior, or even in supervision, you could notice like, oh, that's something I hadn't thought of before. So if over time they don't start to have better answers to that question, I know I'm not yet doing something that is producing some tacting of experiences while you're having them, which is what you need for insight and to be able to start learning by yourself. And so what I'm trying to produce is a little bit of that self-noticing repertoire. And if I'm not getting any of it, I'd start to feel a little nervous that my supervision's not moving the needle on that, and it might not be moving the needle on some other things as well. I'm pretty sure that if I keep in there, I can teach them to do discrete trials or teach them to write a purpose statement for a program or, what have you, get the data collection accurate. But it's those kinds of repertoires that I almost feel like I need some repeated data points, right? Where I can ask the same kind of question and I should over time be able to see a more robust answer, because it shouldn't be unexpected, right? Like if you're asking that just about every supervision session or after you observe them, like they ought to be expecting it. And so if they still can't provide a good answer, it suggests you're not moving the needle with your strategy.
Yeah. I love that.
I agree. I like that reference to being able to tact what they're experiencing. I think that's a critical feature.
I think one other source of information for me has been to kind of just talk things out with a trusted colleague or a mentor. I think it's difficult to have someone actually be able to observe your supervisory practices. Like, I think that there are rare situations where, I'm supervising Lisa and Linda is supervising me, and I can say, Linda, come watch my supervision with Lisa. If you have that, that's amazing and use it. But I have rarely had that as an opportunity. So often what I will do is just kind of sort of describe things to a colleague or a mentor. And they frequently are able to point out areas of growth that I might not have been able to notice, because I might even be describing something that I think is going really well. And I might hear from them, well, that's certainly one way to conceptualize that. On the other hand, have you ever thought about blah, blah, blah effect, or maybe if you tried X, Y, Z? And so I wonder if either of you have leveraged that in terms of trying to evaluate the effects of your supervisory practices.
Yeah, certainly I've had conversations with other people, and I think, I haven't had the opportunity to do this, but I think another aspect that may be really helpful is being able to observe somebody else as a supervisor to really kind of get a feel for, what could I steal from this person that is so awesome that may take me to the next level, and something that I hadn't even thought of doing. And so I think that definitely leveraging other people who are doing some similar work would be a great idea.
Mm-hmm. And I think a naturally occurring opportunity when I have had the circumstances to be around another supervisor is when either someone is transitioning the supervision to me or I'm transitioning the supervision to them. I'll often say, let's do at least one meeting together. And, we're going to introduce or what have you. But then there's also going to be, I try to be mindful to have this mix of, let me show you a little bit how I might ask them questions or guide them through talking about their cases, and then turn it over a little bit. And then I get to watch maybe how this other person asks different questions or maybe uses their facial expressions to differentially reinforce behavior in a different way than I would. And so that doesn't happen all of the time, but boy, when it does, and you've got an incoming and an outgoing supervisor, no matter which end you're on, it's a great opportunity to see how people can respond slightly differently to the same circumstances. And it's also interesting to see, how does the supervisee respond a little differently? Are they brighter in that joint session? Are they a little bit more reluctant, but they warm up over time? And, any change, whether you intended it or not, or, you're contriving it or you're capturing it as it's going, seeing how it changes the supervisee's behavior can give you at least something to think about, and then to self-reflect, well, gee, I wonder why that was different. Or even, gosh, why did I notice so much that that person was asking great questions? Maybe because I'm not asking some of those questions and I'm gonna steal them, you know?
Yeah, I think those are great strategies. I love that idea of even just exposing your trainee or supervisee to other sources of supervision or what have you, and then kind of just observing how they react. So because we are getting kind of close to the end, I wonder maybe, Lisa, can you talk a little bit about strategies for using all of this data? Like when you've got trainees, you've got folks that you're running through and you're helping them with their supervised fieldwork experience hours. What are you doing with the data that you capture, whether or not it's their specific data, client related data, your own reflection on your interactions with them? What do you do with it?
I make behavior change.
Yeah, you do.
Mic drop, the end.
So like, let's say, for example, I do a group supervision session and I deliver a training on a particular topic. So I go through my didactic training, I show my videos and things like that. I keep that PowerPoint open, and then I go back and I make changes in that PowerPoint later on based off of like how that flowed, what went well, what went what do I want to do differently, which scenarios really seem to like kind of confuse people as opposed to enlighten people, things like that. So I think that that's like one strategy that I take with like that ongoing improvement. And I know that in one of the articles that you wrote together with Amber Valentino in 2016 was related to that supervisory relationship and the importance of when you get feedback, you gotta make the change immediately. It's just so important. There's nothing worse than putting that behavior on extinction and not
Don't
making the
expect
change.
to get it again.
Exactly.
Like it doesn't take very many trials of you didn't make the change, and that'll be gone. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I even think taking a moment to tacked it explicitly to the feedback giver. And even if they didn't give you the feedback directly, but you picked up something, to say back like, hey, Lisa, remember 2 weeks ago when you gave me feedback about XYZ, this is what I've done. Is it fixing the issue? Is this better for you? And assuming that the change is good, maybe I've tried it out in other supervisory relationships, and I can even report back like, this actually has really helped me streamline processes or get better outcomes with my other trainees. And I just want to thank you. So kind of like that idea, when I think about doing the performance diagnostic checklist for human services, which is something I love. I love that idea of considering, does the individual ever see the outcome? And I think about when you think about feedback, there are so many times that we make the change, which is awesome. But what if that person can't expressly tact or don't know the degree to which that change has made your life better or other people's lives better? And so why don't we just say it? And so I've tried that out over the last few years, and it's been very effective for me, and also just provides that opportunity to sort of engage in mutual positive regard with your supervisees and trainees.
Mm-hmm. And it gives you the opportunity to model being appreciative of feedback and using data. And we certainly want to model that every day if we can.
Hallelujah.
The one last thing I would love for us to talk about, and that is the notion that particularly if it's a trainee, someone who's kind of, you learn to be a supervisor very often from your supervision. And that notion of being really transparent about the fact that you are evaluating the effects of your supervision and you are making changes accordingly, that transparency hopefully is going to influence their future supervisory practices too, right? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think, you know, whether we realize it or not, we are modeling supervision and those supervision practices all the time. And so we want to be thoughtful about what it is that we're communicating and whether or not that is what we want to continue within the field.
Yeah.
No super sneaky data, transparent data.
Yeah, not super sneaky. I'm 100% a fan of tacting what you're doing and why you're doing it for your trainees, because I used to be terrible at doing that. So bad. Like I really had to develop that skill. I'm not a good self-observer. I'm not really good at tacting what was effective and efficient for me and what's not. And that's not so great for me, but it's even worse for anybody I'm trying to train, because how can I describe things then for them? And so I agree 100% that is a critical piece in everything we do, but especially in evaluating the effects of our supervisory practices. And then I think you get this other effect, which is communicating that I value you as a trainee, because I care that your time is valuable and that I produce the best outcomes I can with you. And the way I do that is by making sure that the things I'm doing are effective, and not only effective, but also acceptable, right? There's a social validity piece. So like, yes, I'm moving the needle on your acquisition, but it also feels good to you. You like it. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah. And I think you guys do a really nice job of talking about that in terms of the importance of that bi-directional collaborative relationship. And when you establish that expectation from the beginning, it just sets the occasion for those conversations to go both ways.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is such a great place almost to like wrap up this conversation, that idea that, you know, having that bi-directional relationship where you both have skin in the game, you both value each other, you're both watching out for the positive outcomes, really kind of is the crux of why you would evaluate the effects of your supervision, right?
Absolutely. One of the most important things we do, one of the biggest impacts we have on the field, and it's worthwhile to do it well. And don't assume you're doing it well until you have some data to support some of that, and really let it be your area of continued evolution and growth. Wonderful. Well, so Lisa, we're going to wrap up, but I will just say one thing. In your consulting practice, you do a lot of remote supervision that your clients are supervisees, trainees, what have you. And do you offer group supervision sessions for people if you're not doing their individual supervision? Is that something that I think there are lots of places where people are getting individual supervision, but they don't really have an opportunity and a structure to get some group supervision. And there can be some really important and valuable components of group supervision. Not only you can do some different things because you have peers, but it's also another different supervisor that they can see. Is that something that you are offering with your consulting service?
I do have group supervision. I don't currently have anyone who's just solely doing group supervision with me. And one of the challenges is that I would have to link up with their organization so that if they're counting those supervision hours as supervision, that they're meeting that 50-50 requirement in terms of the amount of time that they're in group versus individual. So there's some, things to kind of iron out in order to make that happen. But I have worked with some people in the past who simply just wanted to be a part of that group and didn't even count that as their supervision hours because it was just, they found that to be of value.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And that's really what I was thinking of is once you have that experience of learning in that group setting and seeing other people interacting with the same material as you, that's appealing and might be an appealing option to people out there. So thanks for all that you're doing to make the world a better place for the people you supervise, and also for contributing to the literature on supervision, because it's starting to grow. We're starting to get there. And there was a time when we didn't have much. So very grateful to you for having written your book and doing all the good stuff that you're doing. And most importantly, for you joining us today on this episode of The Lift.
Well, thank you. I was so happy to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This is a great conversation. And we will be back with another episode. Bye, everyone.